All right, let's get started. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to our first or the second speaker series for this academic year for the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. My name is Kenji Yoshino, and I'm the faculty director of the Meltzer Center. For this event, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Orly Lobel, Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at University of San Diego School of Law, and the author of multiple books, including, most recently, The Equality Machine, Harnessing Digital Technology for a Brighter, More Inclusive Future. A preeminent scholar of labor and employment law, Professor Lobel serves as the director of USD's Center for Employment and Labor Policy. Her areas of expertise include intellectual property, employment discrimination, consumer law, and digital technology, among others. Professor Lobel clerked on the Israeli Supreme Court and previously taught at Yale Law School. She also served as a fellow at the Harvard Center for Ethics and the Professions, the Kennedy School of Government, and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. Professor Lobel holds an LLB from Tel Aviv University, an LLM from Harvard Law School, and a Doctor of Juridical Science, also from Harvard. I'm so delighted to welcome her to NYU Law. Orly, welcome.
Thank you, Kenji. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Toward the end of today's program, I'll open up for Q&A. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So I want to begin, Orly, by saying, and I'm going to call you by your first name because we knew each other half a lifetime ago, so I hope that's okay. It's such a delight to be reconnected with you over this excellent book. Early in that book, you acknowledged the numerous headlines suggesting that new technologies have a gender or a race problem, whether that be credit algorithms that prefer men over women, facial recognition systems that fail to recognize non-white faces, or social media platforms that prioritize profit over the well-being of teenage girls. You argue, though, that we should, quote, flip the script and instead adopt a mindset that inequality faces a tech challenge. Can you please expand on what you mean by that? How does flipping the script help us work through these issues?
Yeah, well, thank you. And yes, Kenji, I'm so delighted to converse again. It's been too long, as we said. So, as you said, I was motivated to write this book because we had, and I still think that we have a pretty narrow script about how technology creates inequality, exacerbates, accelerates biases and inequities. And the equality machine never denies that we've had fails, that there can be harms, that we have seen different practices by technology companies that are unethical. The flipping the script is reimagining and a call to action to actually look at what are the best scenarios, what are the best uses of something that is here to stay, is being used by both private industry and the public sector. Whether we want it or not, the train has left the station. To mix metaphors, we're not putting the genie back into the bottle. And what we really need to do is differentiate between the uses of the tools that are harmful, the design and the deployment of AI that fails us, and the potential, the benefits that are here and we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, thank you for that. One of the things that I really appreciated about the book was its nuanced approach to this. As you say, like not gainsaying that there are issues, and particularly with regard to D&I with the new technologies, but also seeing the potential and not wanting to add yet another metaphor to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Right.
So to continue in that vein, you write about a couple of unhelpful dichotomies. So one dichotomy is the split between insiders who have a utopian view of technology and outsiders who have a dystopian one. Another dichotomy is a split between bias fixers on the one hand and bias blockers on the other. Can you speak a little bit more about these dichotomies and why you advocate that we move beyond such black and white thinking?
Yeah, so to me, there's something of a vicious cycle, or even kind of a perverse narrowing of the direction that technology is heading to, when it turns out that the people that most care about equality and diversity and ethics and our commitments to democratic values are in this camp of critiquing and pointing to the risks and the harms without offering constructive solutions, and without being kind of with skin in the game. That's another term that I use a lot in the book, where there is the vicious cycle is that we're sending a message. I see this with the new generation of students that we're teaching, that we're sending out to the world. We're sending a message that Silicon Valley is, bro culture. It's very homogenous. It is all about profit. And so if you are someone who cares about, like doing good, don't be part of the problem in a sense. Now, so that's the dichotomy of alarmists that we're not seeing rich solutions or rich visions of how to redirect and harness technology for good, and then kind of these utopian descriptions that really don't consider the question of who wins, who loses. How do we think about distribution and equality? On the kind of bias fixers and bias deniers, I think that there's, as you kind of described, there's a big spectrum of what does it mean to have a direction of equality within our technologies. And what, for me, it's very important that we be accurate in where the problem lies. So you already, Kenji, described at the very beginning, what happens when facial recognition, it turns out that it fares better with white male faces than other demographics, or what happens when we find out that a hiring app is just replicating the past hires of that were a very non-diverse group of, again, white men, was just like the reported hiring app that Amazon tried to design. What I see time and again in not only the reports in the media, not only the scholarship, the legal scholarship, the academic articles that are kind of citing to those problems of bias in technologies that were designed, that were tested, but even in reports by government agencies, congressional hearings, we see a lot of outdated examples that are being rehashed and kind of not then kind of thought of as, so what is the source of the problem? And what I try to do in the Equality Machine is to say there's lots of sources of the problem. It's not like bias fixing is one solution, just change the application in some way. Sometimes it is. So sometimes we're talking about partial data or skewed data that's being fed to big data set that, machine learning application, large language models that learn, the wrong things because we haven't given them a full spectrum of the human experience. Sometimes the source of the bias is, or the inequities that are spit out by a hiring app, is that it's reflecting the deep inequities that exist in our society. And there, I don't think that the fix is the technology itself. I think that technology is like a mirror in our face, helping us detect the root causes of our inequities, helping us see more clearly where we need to put more resources, where we need to change ourselves, our institutions, our societies, where we need to invest. And so kind of thinking about like technology as just, this magic wand of a solution is just not going to get us to where we need to be, but it's a helpful tool to understand, what we need to be doing.
Yeah, and this next question follows directly on that, which is, human beings are flawed too. And it struck me that, if both human beings and algorithms are flawed and make decisions that can perpetuate bias and discrimination, then what's the standard, right? What standard should we hold algorithms to? And more specifically, do we need to be persuaded that an algorithm has eliminated all bias before we use it? Or does it just need to be better than a human being is likely to do in the same situation?
Yeah, so absolutely the right question to ask, and very important point that I try to make in the equality machine is that we should not have a double standard of an AI application versus our status quo, our human decision making. We should always hold on to this question of a comparative advantage. And again, as somebody who teaches, like you, Kenji, discrimination law, and I serve as an expert in employment discrimination cases, and I see it up close, how difficult it is. I do also research, behavioral research, collaborating with social psychologists and behavioral economists on our biases, not just our identity based biases, but in general, our cognitive failures, our cognitive limits, our computational limits, and depletion of, in our judgment and decision making. For me, it's very, very important that we understand that there are a lot of ways that algorithms, that just kind of the computational abilities of digital technology can outperform what we're doing all the time. And in fact, in the equality machine, I go through a lot of different sectors, and I focus and begin with the lens of equality, but I think that we need to have this conversation on all the fronts of what we're trying to achieve. So on safety, on accuracy and fairness, and well-being, for example, on kind of the health side. I see this again, time and again. I just got back from Stanford Medical School. The faculty selected the equality machine as the required reading for all the med students this year. And part of the message is, when you're thinking as a physician, whether you are going to trust a bot that has the ability to screen mammograms. And in the past, it was a human radiologist. The right question is not whether it is completely error-free. It is 100% accurate. We have to compare it to how human radiologists make decisions. And on top of that, one of the, again, an important argument that I'm making on the comparative advantage side is that we also need to think about scaling and resources. So it's also just, I think, hubris to say, to ask the question in kind of a very, just kind of who, who are the rich that have the best access to our healthcare, potential and our resources. So, for example, if you see sometimes reporters saying, well, if you take the two best radiologists in the whole country and you compare them to a bot that's already in existence, they're still slightly outperforming this bot. And the reality is that the vast majority of people around the world don't have those resources to physicians that are highly trained. So the question is the status quo, all the fails that we have there, and comparing it to what is the potential of introducing technology that can help us better achieve our goals.
Can I ask you where that status quo comes from? Because I do, notice this in myself all the time. And I found myself thinking like, if you play chess, right, it's, can this computer beat Kasparov or something? But I take from your book that, in the vast run of cases, you're not really, the choice is not between like Kasparov and, the computer. It's between like, the person down the street who plays chess as a kind of hobbyist and the computer, right? And the computer can generally beat them. And so that train of imagining led me to think, is it because this is so pervasive now in a way that it used to be an oddity, right? That, AI or algorithms or computers could do these things. Now that they're so intricated, as you mentioned, in our way of life, that, we can't get rid of them even if we wanted to, right? That we need to sort of recalibrate. So that's one possible explanation, but you're obviously the expert. So where's this double standard coming from?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in general, we have this kind of status quo stickiness bias where losses loom larger than risks of any change. So this is a behavioral bias that is well documented, that goes well beyond this question of shifting to technological solutions, but just any kind of change. It turns out that we feel the pain of whatever loss that we have from that shift, more than noticing all the gains that happen from that. That's one source. Another source is the fact that you mentioned kind of chess experts and the lay people that are most of us in most fields. We do have this another kind of behavioral bias of it's not only optimism bias, but kind of the holier than thou bias of we think. So, for example, with thinking about ourselves as not having identity biases is anybody who's taken an IAT test is there's kind of that shock of, well, for me too, I think I care about equality, I want to be inclusive, and then it turns out that we all have unconscious biases, and we all have this trouble to overcome whatever we have, but we're not very aware of that. And then I think specifically with technology, and I take some time in the book to study this kind of culturally and generationally. I think that throughout our histories, we've had this great ambivalence with technology. And we see this very much right now, even after the book came out with the iterations of ChatGPT. We've seen this very much what I call the Terminator fallacy of kind of zoning in on this unknown, improbable, but very, very scary idea that, again, we've always had throughout our histories, from Frankenstein or Golem, to Hollywood, of the machines will take away our control and they'll, come alive and terminate us. And it turns out that not every culture has that. So it was actually important for me to travel. At first, while I was writing The Equality Machine, it was traveling virtually because it was during COVID to Japan. And then actually after, and to South Korea. And after the book came out, the Japanese government actually somehow got hold of The Equality Machine, and I became a G7 representative of the World Economic Forum to the Japanese government on their digital transformation. But their particular history with robotics was different post World War II, of really kind of understanding AI, and specifically embodied AI, humanoid robots, as a savior or potentially kind of a recovery and a boost to a society that really was, rebuilding. And so it's not as much, in the Japanese culture, this aversion of, getting us to a better decision-making state or relational, work that will achieve our goals using technology. And I think that generationally we'll also see this. I don't see my students as scared of autonomous vehicles as much as my colleagues, who do not want to give up the wheel, just like some of them don't want to give up the guns. It's just a whole other story. But I think there is something about kind of this control and the fantasy or horror stories that, again, I wanted to us to have conversations that would overcome those alarmist stories about machines taking over.
That is so fascinating. I mean, I grew up about a quarter of my life in Japan, so I can say purely anecdotally and irresponsibly that sort of resonates deeply with me, where a deep part of sort of manga or anime culture, right? It's, robots or machines that have a really positive, and we see that, trickling over even to the West from Japanese producers and themes like Big Robot or Big Hero 6 or what have you, right? So it's fascinating. I want to think more about that. So I appreciate that. So they often say like other countries are our past, but I think what you're also saying is other countries may be our future too, if you look at generational divides, where the younger generation may be more sort of narrowly Japanese in that respect than otherwise. So I want to just to roll up our sleeves a little bit and talk about particular D&I contexts. So one of the things that is wonderful about this book is that you're so kind of careful and thorough and just really magisterial in the kind of context that you cover. So I just wanted to give our listeners some taste of that. So let's start with a relatively kind of simple one, right? So could you tell us a little bit about how digital technology can help us close gender and racial pay gaps?
Yeah, so that's something that I had thought about a lot. Again, teaching employment discrimination, employment law. It was specifically a topic that I became very frustrated with, because the statistics and the empirical research showed very clearly that if we just do the same thing that we've been doing for decades, the gender and racial gap will possibly close in 104 years, were kind of some of the statistics. But in fact, if you just look at the past decade, it was stagnating even more. And so there was kind of this horizon of, well, if we do nothing, nothing will happen, and we'll just continue on this 80 cents to the dollar for women, on average, but even worse, of course, for women of color. And then I started looking for, positive examples. And again, the whole book is about like, let's showcase the best examples, not just showcase the fails that we hear about all the time. And it turns out that there are a lot of positive examples where companies have been introducing software and machine learning to really detect, like constantly the differences, not just across in big companies in large Fortune 500 companies. You have so many job descriptions, and kind of taking a very formalistic, narrow approach of, well, just we'll just compare these two people who are in exactly the same job category will not get you very far. But taking a much broader brush of looking at pay gaps, how they happen, how they increase over time, both kind of the private sector doing that proactively, but also reporting that is done to agencies like the EEOC, or in the UK, mandatory reporting. Knowledge and information is the great equalizer in that sense, and agencies themselves have to use these digital tools to mine through millions of data points to really detect these differences and provide us with a greater picture, a better picture. And then kind of the third component of this is that as I said, knowledge is power, and there's been vast asymmetry between what employees know about whether they're underpaid or not, and most of the time it's the companies that hold the information. And in fact, it's kind of another field of my research, arguing against the enforcement of NDAs, too broad, secrecy and confidentiality clauses. So I had written quite a bit about that. It's also part of my previous books, Talent Wants to Be Free and You Don't Own Me, is a lot about these like asymmetries. And what I saw when I started researching this issue and the potential for digital platforms and kind of social connectivity on the internet is that, again, these applications where there was crowdsourcing of knowledge that was input by employees from all over, was really giving employees the tools to make demands, to understand how they are underpaid, where jobs are better. So again, just kind of this, I mean, I think it's just one example of we've always known that knowledge and education is the great democratizer and the kind of great push for better terms, better conditions, redistribution, and so with salaries and compensation, I think it's kind of quite a low-hanging fruit, that because a lot of it is numerical, that we want to have the aid of aggregation and kind of constant auditing that AI allows us.
I so appreciate that. So just a couple of footnotes. One, because I want to avoid the curse of knowledge here. You mentioned earlier the IAT, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's implicit association test. If you want to take a look at it, it's just Google like Harvard implicit. Mazar Banaji was an early guest of the speaker series. It's a measure of our implicit biases. And so that's what Orly was talking about when you were talking about the holier than thou phenomenon. An NDA is a non-disclosure agreement. So with that, let me go on to a more kind of subtle, counterintuitive context, I think, where I think if we're talking about pay gaps, people think, well, that's math, right? That's data, that's, aggregation. And so, yes, I trust a computer would be better at doing that, or an algorithm would do better at it. One of the things that may be less intuitive is sexual harassment, right? So you argue that technology can help employees report and address grievances in a safer and more accessible way. It could potentially help with both detection and training. So could you say more about how technology can address harassment?
Yeah, so this is, first of all, I think we all know, I don't need to say a lot about how Me Too was really kind of fueled by hashtag Me Too, which is all, social media, kind of online. The recent social movements are very much aided by having access and digital connectivity. But post Me Too, or kind of coming out of Me Too, there have been kind of a burgeoning industry of technologies that allow anonymous reporting, and it's so one of the big problems with reporting harassment is that we're kind of in this prisoner's dilemma. We're in a situation where no one wants to go at it alone. There's so many negative social consequences and psychological fears and monetary retaliation a lot of the times for standing as the David versus the Goliath and reporting something that was wrong. And that's true with any kind of whistleblowing, not just with harassment, but specifically with harassment. We've had years of concealment through NDAs, through shaming, through retaliation. And what we have with these new tools is some trust in, and again, it's all about designing them to be trustworthy, but we can have these tools where like one design element would be that, you know, only when you have more than one person reporting the same person, then you know, there's now a revelation, and before that, the employer doesn't have access to that internal reporting. So that can be a technological solution, but it tracks, you know, it tracks the time, and you know, it has kind of that trustworthiness that maybe we don't have when we're just talking to an HR person. I'm actually just right now writing something new that I can't really talk about yet, but about like years of reporting to HR that had like a separate file cabinet, and just they just locked it. So if you have a third party provider that really, you know, shows us that they are storing these kinds of reports, it's all going to be tracked. That can be a game changer. There's something more that I say in the chapter about what I call bot2, hashtag bot2, that is more controversial. And Kenji, I would love for you to chime in. And you know, I think this is a conversation that we need to have as a society. And it relates, if you know, if some of our listeners or some of the participants here are thinking about predictive analytics, predictive policing, a lot of different questions that right now AI knows things about us that we don't know. You mentioned the IAT test. I talked about you know, unconscious biases. We also, you know, there's a lot of technologies right now, and we can argue about how accurate they are, and you know, where we're heading, but they are getting more accurate, that through emotional recognition, for example, facial recognition that looks at our facial expressions, through you know, machine learning that looks at all our movements, all our the types of words that we're using. It can recognize propensities to do harm before we actually know that we will you know, potentially become a harasser, or that we will create a hostile work environment, and it can flag it. And I discussed this kind of in potential, these tools that are already developed and some companies use. It is undeniable that there is a tension there between the wanting to prevent sexual harassment and concerns about privacy, concerns about autonomy, concerns about how we normally only want to go after anybody who actually did something harmful, not just because they have a personality that might become a harasser. And you know, we want to have this you know, we want to keep I believe the freedom to, you know, exercise your agency to prevent, you know, to self-prevent these harms. But we need to have those conversations, frankly. You know, where do we draw those red lines? One of the things, again, that I think is controversial, and Kenji, you can chime in, and I've been writing about this in the Equality Machine, but even after the Equality Machine, I wrote a couple of more controversial, I think, because of their kind of headlines, shorter essays about how, as a society in general, we have been privileging privacy to the detriment of other values. So I like privacy. I mean, I'm not against privacy. I'm on the board of the Future of Privacy Forum, which is, you know, the world's largest privacy nonprofit organization, and I think it's an important value. But I think that we have to be clear and honest about how it's not the only value, and sometimes it will be in tension with other goals, including equality and inclusion, including safety and accuracy, including the collective good, for example, in kind of healthcare and, you know, fighting a global pandemic. And I think that it's very much kind of part of the alarmist story. We haven't talked about that aspect yet, of kind of, just like we have these really scary titles about automating inequality and weapons of mass destruction that are all about like amplifying our biases through technology, we also have these very scary titles of surveillance capitalism, like, you know, everything about technology is about extracting and monitoring and datifying ourselves. And, you know, yes, there is something about that, but there's also, you know, this other aspect of, we want to know more. What we talked about with pay, you know, it goes through a lot of other things that we want to know about, you know, what does our society look like? What are the root causes of not only inequities, but human suffering and, you know, our wicked problems, environmental challenges, you know, poverty, everything else. So I really feel, and again, Kenji, I want you to chime in, but I feel that we're not having a rich enough discussion about all of those. And how do we, I actually, again, this is my optimistic kind of constructive lens in the equality machine, I actually show that technology can a lot of times help us mitigate some of those tensions, although they will continue to be part of what we need to be discussing. And we can never completely do away with, you know, the fact that we've always had, you know, multiple normative commitments, and they, you know, you can't have everything all the time.
Yeah. So I love that. This is such a fascinating conversation. Let me first say that the easy one for me is what you articulated earlier with sexual harassment and the information escrow that tips once you get a certain number of reports. I think I've always thought that that was a really fascinating idea. I think getting, you know, algorithms involved in that project just seems like a really easy win from my perspective. I think this other set of issues is far more complicated in all the ways that you describe, where, you know, as people who listen to me know, I say ad nauseum, the hard questions on life are not good versus evil, but good versus good, the kind of Isaiah Berlin competing goods hypothesis, right? So stopping sexual harassment is a good, you know, privacy is a good. I would also add here that it seems like there's a due process aspect to this as well, because it's not really just my privacy, it's the, I haven't done anything wrong, comma, yet, and I may not ever do anything wrong. It's just that a flag is being sent up by this algorithm that is going to cause me to be surveyed and monitored and possibly penalized in ways that, you know, I wasn't anticipating. So, you know, this may seem like a kind of easy way out, Orly, but I will say you've thought much more deeply about this. This is the seat of the pants assessment. I might drive a wedge in between the extent to which we're using that information of the flag being sent up based on, say, an expression of contempt, you know, that crosses my face when I'm interacting with a particular group, or a particular set of behaviors that are unprofessional and troubling, right, directionally, right, in the sense of harassment, and whether that's used like the IAT is generally used in order to allow for self-assessment. So I can reflect on this flag that's being raised. I would feel really differently if, say, an employer had access to my IAT results and was saying, oh, Kenji, you have these unconscious biases that are kind of off the charts, and so therefore, you know, we're not going to trust you to supervise individuals of a particular group or what have you, right? So the kind of first party, third party distinction would be a really important one for me in this domain. I nonetheless think it would be like a huge win to have it be available for self-assessment. You know, I think about Angelo and Measure for Measure, right? Who says, like, ever till now, when men were fond, I smiled and wondered how. So he just doesn't believe that he can be a sexual harasser until he suddenly is one, right? So being able to say to that person, let's hold the mirror up to your own, you know, self, and to say that these flags have been sent up might be kind of a warning signal where somebody could stop themselves, right? Assuming that they had the ideal of not wanting to be in the harassing category before things were, it was too late to do that, or before they had already acted. So I think for me, at least, seat of the pants, sort of off the cuff response, Orly, since you invited me in on this, is to say, I think it's really intriguing. Obviously, people like you are going to need to think much more deeply about this on behalf of all of us, right? But one kind of seat of the pants distinction I would make would be between using the information as a means of self-reflection and then using the information to hand over to third parties so that those third parties can regulate me. That seems like a really important from the jump distinction that we would want to draw.
I think that's a very important distinction, very useful distinction. In general, what I see with privacy that is kind of too flat, too tunnel visioned in our discussions, and you see this in the legislation and kind of the terms that are coming out, even more so from the EU and the GDPR, and right now the EU AI Act, is this term of data minimization and kind of not extracting rather than focusing on the misuses and like what do we do with the information that we have. So that's a distinction in general that I try to draw, or an argument that I make. You and I have talked even before our conversation now about how this is also true with kind of the inputs versus the outputs when we think about equality and kind of this idea that or the lens that we've been given in the United States in particular of color blindness as or gender blindness, identity blindness as the way of thinking about anti-discrimination. And not having, richer discussions about what about the outputs, what about looking at equality and equity and inclusion in kind of more substantive ways of, what who gets promoted and so forth. But one thing that I will say about that distinction that you're making between self-assessment and third parties, because the law professor, the employment law professor in me has to say this, is that because and you also mentioned due process. I do want to say that there will be also intermediate, I think, legitimate uses beyond just the self-assessment when we're talking about prevention, because in corporations, and again, it's something that I care about because I just served as an expert witness in such case, which was a large corporation that had complaints by several victims of sexual harassment. And the harasser that was terminated argued that there wasn't due process, that there wasn't like kind of this proof that he, under Title VII was a sexual harasser. And I do want to emphasize to all of, our participants that that's not the standard that organizations have to be held to, that Title VII and the EOC wants prevention, and it is okay to see that somebody is sending all sorts of very problematic emails to different people and engaging in unwelcome behavior, and the standard that the employer has to keep in mind is not whether they've already, if they are in court, have reached that level that Title VII requires as sexual harassment, but to engage in prevention. So again, I think step one, self-assessment, an email will pop up as, maybe you don't want to send this, language to your coworker or something like that. But then, we can do more in terms of moderating and using AI to flag things that are problematic and to act on them.
Wonderful. So we're going to turn to audience Q&A after I ask one more question. So please send questions through that you want to ask Orly. I can't resist asking this question, though, as a kind of moderator's prerogative before I turn to those questions, which is about VR. So you write about the increased use of AI and virtual reality to teach people empathy and to reduce bias. And we were fortunate to have Jeremy Bailenson from Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab, whom you cite in your book, right, join the speaker series several years ago. And I have to say that, like, we were nuts about this, Orly, because we thought, oh, this is so promising. But then when we did a deeper dive into it, we worried about sort of considerations in both directions. So one was we worried that someone would put on a VR headset, like experience life as, say, somebody of a different race, and then be like, okay, I know everything there is to know, and kind of overestimate the amount of empathy and knowledge they had acquired. And then we also saw studies that were cautioning us against the dangers in the other direction of someone, say, putting on a headset and experiencing life for like one day as a person with a motor function disability, right? And then thinking like, oh, this is like really, really awful, without having the kind of understanding that people with disabilities are incredibly resilient and human beings are incredibly resilient and they can learn and adapt over time. So what it feels like on day one is not what it feels like, a year or 2 years or 5 years out, right? So we ended up saying, like, there's so many concerns here. We're going to back away from this. This looks really interesting, but it's not a place where we should make an investment. Should we change that assessment now, or were we wrong then? And even if we were right then, are we wrong now with regard to thinking about the use of VR to advance D&I concerns?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question, and very, I think, contextual. I think it depends on the goal that you're trying to achieve. So like I totally agree with you that just like, being in some like virtual reality game for one day is not going to shed our biases. It's not going to teach us, what we need to know. And that's a much more like long-term and, complicated process. And so if that's like, if you're, I agree that I would be very concerned, like, to think about, that's kind of the bias fixers, like, very that you asked me about. The kind of positive examples are much more targeted. Like I give the example of like the United Nations wanting to do a fundraiser for refugees, or like when there's some environmental disaster somewhere, and you just create more empathy for that purpose of a fundraising, of kind of giving money. You can't argue with that's what they wanted to achieve, and just kind of having you go through that virtual reality like tour of the place, rather than just kind of reading about it. It ignites your hotter system, not just cold systems, and kind of gives you a little bit more of a sense of that. So again, that's kind of a narrow use, a very specific use that we can measure, and we don't get into those worries of kind of over relying or under understanding. I'll just say one more thing, and I'm so excited to get. I see we already have quite a few questions, but one more thing that it reminded me of that we should mention. So I'm kind of a Goldilocks kind of girl, as you see in the equality machine. I want to get it right. I want to get it rationally right. And one of the things that's kind of I continue to work on, and I'm collaborating with some of my co-authors on, and I think it's kind of a nascent direction and frontier for anybody who's concerned about how to use technology right, for good, AI for good, is this well-documented phenomenon that like seems like they're opposing phenomenon, but they coexist, of algorithmic aversion and algorithmic adoration. So we have these both, like we have a tendency to overtrust and to undertrust technology in different contexts. And for me, it's very important to think very clearly about, not just how to create trustworthy AI, but also how to educate ourselves to offer the right kind of trust, whether it's VR, but any other thing, like a bot surgeon, or autonomous vehicle, or a chat bot. How do we teach ourselves? And I think it's a public policy responsibility. It shouldn't just be like, each person at it alone, like, educating ourselves about like when ChatGPT 4 is hallucinating or not. It should be a national and international global goal to create, more access and kind of digital education for all of us to exercise the right kind of trust. And I'll just say that because we are not having robust enough conversations and we're just warning our our children, it's all algorithms that just want your profits and just stay off the social media. I don't think we're doing enough on that front of helping us really kind of interact, which we do, and happily we do. So how to interact with these technologies in rational and correct ways.
Great. Yeah. And this follows directly on that because it goes to like the ought implies can kind of thing. These technologies are here to stay. So how do we actually work with them? The question is, many of us are leveraging generative AI or ChatGPT for the first time within our organizations. It's my fear that our organizations are not considering DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion implications. What specific actions can we take to test these new internal platforms to ensure equitable outputs are provided and DEI is considered?
Yeah, great. So again, I think that a lot of the reports about, for example, when companies introduce AI in resume parsing and hiring apps and evaluation, performance evaluation, the technologies that are looked at or the stories that are told and retold are quite outdated. So, for example, the story of Amazon, I get very frustrated because I see the story of Amazon trying to adopt in their company a hiring app, and then the result was that just hire white men that play lacrosse called Jared. That story just appears and reappears even like a couple of months ago when John Oliver did an AI segment. Again, he tells this story, which is about an application, an algorithm that was designed 10 years ago, never was deployed because there was audits that were done before it was deployed. So one thing is that I think that administrative agencies need to be much more in the business of helping us differentiate between the snake oil and the best standards for these algorithms that do consider constantly diversity and inclusion. I think that the gold standard right now, having talked, one of the things that I tried to do in the Equality Machine is to talk to people in computer science that are actually designing these better applications. The gold standard is to have at least two algorithms constantly working together, where one is doing the sorting and the other is constantly doing the auditing. Another is that there are what computer scientists call exploitation algorithms. There's kind of this design of just replicate what we've done in the past, exploit the patterns and the past practices. That is prone to increasing biases. And then exploration algorithms is telling the application, try to find undervalued talents, try to find other ways that will get you to more equitable results than we've had in the past. And there's a lot there that seems very promising, but it will be contextual. But these are the questions that we have to ask the designers. We have to constantly be aware of when we're deploying internally these applications. There's a lot of examples. I mean, the question included also ChatGPT. So I go through like these questions about how we can create more like stock images that don't just show us, when we're putting in like, show me a picture of a CEO. We can deliberately say, like always account also for racial and gender diversity when you're showing images. We we being humans, we can actually ask that, but it won't give us, like, technology won't give us those solutions without us asking for it. But it is possible to make that ask in the design.
Let me squeeze two questions in before we hit time. So one actually directly follows on that, which is, how will AI actually fix bias issues when it's mainly people designing the systems? If humans don't currently understand their own biases, how does that get changed in these systems? So it's a who will guard the guardians question. And the other one is, right up your alley in terms of the law and AI, of like, how do we actually ensure that algorithms are held legally responsible? So when an algorithm gives rise to human rights violations, how is legal responsibility determined? In the case of a biased human border guard, we have clearly established rules on legal responsibility. How does legal responsibility play out in cases involving an algorithm that generates a biased outcome? So who will guard the guardians, and then legal responsibility of AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think these questions are connected, right? So we, if we understand that this is where we are, that if you look at, like, the vast majority of Fortune 500 companies using AI in their like work relations and their decision makings about services, then I think we need to be in the business from a policy making perspective of demanding more transparency about what are the applications that are being used. We need to, what I said before, have, and there is a lot of, like, current thinking, we need to have either some processes that are, like, public, like, there's been a lot of talk about an FDA sort of approval of different applications of AI, and not just kind of self-assessments. So this is where I get pretty critical of, like, what the EU offers as, like, just self-assess, high risk, low risk, and that's, I don't think that gets us a lot. There's also, I think, quite promising examples of these bias bounty sort of like hackers that are kind of nonprofit sector hire, or they can be for profit, but these are third parties that are trying to constantly find for vulnerabilities of cybersecurity. We can have, and we should invest as a public through government procurement or other kinds of methods to institutionally have these third parties that are constantly, like, hacking into whether different applications have biases. And I do give examples there with the equality in the equality machine of, like, platforms that have been more transparent, like eBay, giving their data up and showing or finding researchers, academics, should play a big part of this. Finding that certain platform designs of, like, in multi-sided networks can be more prone or can exemplify more biases than other designs that maybe sequence the identity or present information in different ways. So we need to be very deliberate about it. We need to know more. We need to research it. There is a role for policy changes on, like, what is data scraping, what is lawful insertion of these kinds of activities into firewalls, or should there be firewalls, and what is, I mentioned that a big part of my research has always been asking what is really secret, what is really proprietary in corporations, and this is a moment where data should be understood as a public shared resource, and we should be studying it.
Wonderful. Well, I think that brings us to a close. Orly, that was amazing. I only got through half of my questions. We only got to scratch the surface of your incredible book. So this is Orly Lobel, The Equality Machine. Please don't let this discussion be a substitute for actually reading the book. It's really, really rich. And as I said, we only got to scratch the surface of it because of the intensity and wonder of the discussion. So thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations again on the book. And thank you for being such a leading public intellectual and allowing us to have a more nuanced understanding of both the pros and the cons, right, of AI and DEI. Thank you, Orly.
Thank you so much. I also feel like you and I could talk for a few hours, and I would love to hear from readers. It really is a call to a richer conversation that we're all involved in, and more engagement. And things are changing so much all the time. So I look forward to hearing from everybody.
Thanks so much. We're adjourned.